And in the background, I have sort of a white wall with some artwork that's kind of hugging my head. So I'm just going to let everybody know that this event is being recorded with speaker view. It will be transcribed and shared on ONCA's YouTube channel afterwards. Okay, so thank you for joining us today for a talk by Dr. Adam Elliott-Cooper on the arguments for police and police abolition in the UK and how these connect to climate justice. Expect a presentation by Adam, followed by an opportunity to ask questions. So all money raised tonight through the donations of the talk will be shared with ONCA and Account. Account is a youth-led social action project based in Hackney, London, that monitors and scrutinises police activity to empower young people, generate knowledge, campaign for justice, and hold those in power to account. That sounds like a fantastic organisation. Okay, so a little bit about Adam. I'll give an introduction. Adam will then feed in with his talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. And we will then take questions at the end of that. We'll try to take questions in two ways. So either through the chat box or through raising a hand, and we can sort of take it in turns. Okay, so a little bit about Adam. Dr. Adam Elliott-Cooper is a research fellow in sociology at the University of Greenwich. His research interests include policing, anti-racism, colonialism, and post-colonialism. His current research focuses on resistance to racist state violence in 21st century Britain, with an interest in how this resistance is shaped by histories of imperialism and anti-imperialism. He's published on anti-racism and policing in ethnic and racial studies, Antipode and City, as well as on housing and gentrification in Progress in Human Geography and Sociological Review. He has a forthcoming article in South Atlantic Quarterly analysing the Black Lives Matter movement in Britain, forming part of a special issue on Black Lives Matter scheduled for publication in 2022. His journalistic writing has appeared in The Guardian, Verso Blog, Raw, Open Democracy, and The Voice. Adam also regularly appears on podcasts and broadcast news discussing policing, anti-racism, and racism in Britain. Adam's first monograph, Black Resistance to British Policing, was published by Manchester University Press in May 2021. Well done, Adam. That's a very recent accomplishment. He has also co-authored a book, Empire's Endgame, Racism and the British State, written with 7 other academics, published by Pluto Press in February 2021. Adam sits on the board of the Monitoring Group, an anti-racist organisation challenging state racisms and racial violence. Wow, thank you, Adam. This is quite some contribution to the field already. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Welcome.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Annie. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for everyone at ONCA for the invitation to come and share a small presentation on the research that I've been doing and the work that I've been doing over the last 10 or 12 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a small amount about myself, just to give you a little bit of an idea about the work that I do and where I'm coming from. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the problems of crime and harm and violence that exist within our society, and how we see that those problems of crime and harm and violence being articulated or presented to us by the press or politicians or by the police themselves. And then we'll think about a couple of concepts. I'm not going to get too academic, but I'm going to think about one key concept that I think is really useful and important for us to think about, and that's the concept of institutional racism. Finally, I'm going to, without boring you to death with lots of stats and figures, I'm going to talk about the expansion of the police and prison system in Britain over the last 30 years. And finally, I'll end with thinking through this question of abolitionism and why it is that abolitionism has gained popular interest and I guess influence across social movements and community organizations, as well as in academia and thought elsewhere as well. And after that, we'll probably take a little break and then have a general discussion, chat, questions, and all that good stuff. Great. So I guess I actually became interested in policing, not as a researcher or as a student or as an academic or anything like that, but I became really, I would say, interested in questions of policing in the job that I had before I became an academic, before I did a PhD. So I was a youth worker for a number of years, first in an area of Radford in Nottingham, and following my graduation from university, I started working as a youth worker in Hackney in North East London, and then a few parts of East London as well. And I was always really interested in trying to engage the young people that I was working with in questions of class inequality and class struggle, or questions of racism and anti-racism. And it was always really difficult to try to weave these kinds of conversations into the more formalized tasks that we had to do with these young people, whether it be extra maths and English or IT training or different types of developing different types of skills and what have you. And the one issue that really seemed to spark interest and engagement, even in less formal settings with the young people that we were working with, was the question of policing. As soon as policing was mentioned, something clicked with these young people. And almost every young person that we were working with had an experience themselves, or a friend or a family member or somebody in their community had an experience of policing, of harassments or violence or neglect at the hands of police. And it was through the discussion of these experiences that we could have conversations about social class. You know, okay, so the role of the police is one of the main functions is to protect property. Well, whose property are they protecting? Are they protecting your property? And if not, whose property are they protecting? And this is a really useful way of being able to better understand and think through questions of social class. And of course, the stereotypes and images and experiences of the Black and Asian and other communities of colour within the parts of London that I were working in also were better explored through these experiences of policing. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that I'm not necessarily interested in policing because it is the most important issue that we face as a community or a nation or as a planet today. But it is one of the key issues through which many of the young people that I've worked with as a youth worker were enabled. It was a really useful, I guess, avenue to open up questions and discussions and action that was critical, and that was it better enabled them to have those kinds of conversations and become involved in organising that was grassroots, that was radical, that was political, that was critical, that was urgent, I think. So why is policing such an issue? Why is policing consistently this topic or this idea or this problem that so many young people feel engaged by? Maybe this is a useful question to begin with. I think one of them is because of the way in which it is an experience which is in the immediate reality of many people. It is a very public, sometimes spectacular, sometimes mundane experience of humiliation or dehumanization or violence or neglect. But I think there are other issues as well which are really useful in thinking through questions of policing. And one of them is because of the power that ideas around law and order have for governments to reaffirm their legitimacy, to reaffirm their power. What do I mean by that? So I guess the first kind of concept I want to talk through is this concept of the moral panic. This is a concept that was developed by some people in Birmingham in the 1970s, led by a man called Stuart Hall. And what they noticed in Britain in the 1970s was that there were political speeches, lots of newspaper headlines, and a lot of speeches from police officers talking about a new type of crime. And this new type of crime was called mugging. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with this term, mugging. It's a very commonly used term for kind of street robbery or street theft. But in the 1970s, it was a very new term. And in fact, it had never really existed in Britain at all before the 1970s. And it was a term that had actually been borrowed from the United States. And what's interesting about the term mugging is that mugging isn't actually a crime in and of itself. There's nothing in the statute books, or the legal books, or legislation, or anything like that that has the term mugging. Mugging is a category of crime. And so when a new category of crime is invented, such as mugging, as it was in the 1970s, it kind of vacuums up lots of existing crimes, theft, robbery, assaults, and what have you, into this new category of crime, creating the impression that there is a new problem, that there is a different problem. And therefore, that new and different problem can be attributed to a new and different people. And the new, or purportedly new and different people for which mugging was attributed to in the 1970s was mainly young Black and Asian people. So race played a really crucial role in demonstrating for people how and why it was that this apparently new issue of law and order had arisen in Britain. But there's something else that's important about moral panics, such as mugging. They serve a really crucial purpose for the government, because what Stuart Hall and his colleagues said was that capitalism, our economic system, is constantly in crisis. Right in the 1970s, there was a really bad, maybe some people who are listening or watching this remember even, in the 1970s, there was a very bad economic crisis, problems with employment, problems with wages, problems with pensions, a whole sweep of economic problems. And the government wasn't really in a position to ameliorate these issues, deal with these problems effectively, either because they didn't want to or they were unable to. And so because they're not able to deal with this crisis of capitalism, this economic crisis of employment and wages and what have you, the government begins to suffer a crisis of legitimacy. Right? In the eyes of the public, the government is not seen as legitimate anymore because they're not able to deal with these economic problems, this crisis of capitalism. So what the government therefore do is they invent or manufacture a different crisis, a crisis of law and order, a crisis of criminality and violence and immorality. And by creating this new crisis in the 1970s, this was the crisis of mugging, they're able to then tell everyone that this is the crisis that this country is really facing. Not the problems of their jobs and wages, not problems of pensions or housing or access to services. The real problem that we're facing is a problem of law and order. And it is that problem which the governments are going to deal with. So this question of moral panics plays a really crucial role, I think, in better enabling the government to cement its legitimacy in the eyes of the public. This might be a pattern that we're quite familiar with here today in the 21st century. I would say that the moral panics that we have today aren't necessarily around mugging. I would say they're more around maybe 3 or 4 key, what some scholars call racial folk devils, or criminal folk devils. I would say they are principally the gangster or gangs, the terrorist or terrorism, immigrants or asylum seekers, migrants, and I think increasingly as well, Gypsy Roma traveller communities as well. And like the mugger of the 1970s, this purported crisis of law and order and morality and violence and crime better enables this current government to reaffirm its legitimacy in the eyes of the nation, because this is the crisis that they're going to deal with, the crisis at our borders, the so-called migrant crisis, the crisis in our urban cities, the so-called crisis of law and order. And this is, I think, become increasingly important for governments like the one that we currently have, because, of course, we're not simply faced with an economic crisis leading from the 2007-2008 financial crisis and the austerity that followed. Of course, we also have a housing crisis in many parts of the country. We also have, as I'm sure many of us are aware, an ecological crisis, a looming climate crisis as well. And whether it be the economic crisis of austerity, the looming pensions crisis and housing crisis within our economy, or whether it be the looming ecological and climate crisis that we're facing, neither government is capable or willing to effectively deal with these crises. And so rather than deal with the actual real crises that we're facing, whether it be as a country or as a planet at the moment, they instead seek to deal with a different crisis, this crisis of law and order, of security, of borders, of violence. And as you can probably, or as you probably have already picked up, these new moral panics today, right, like the mugger in the 1970s, the gangster, the terrorist, the immigrants, the gypsy Roma traveller communities. For all of these moral panics today, race plays a really crucial role in painting this picture of disorder, of criminality, of violence, for which the general public requires securing, requires safety from, right? Requires more policing, requires more borders, requires more prisons. And the way in which we see these, the policing of these criminal folk devils, these moral panics, are a really useful way, I think, of understanding the second concept I wanted to talk through today, institutional racism. So let's take the example of the gangster, of the policing of gangs. How can we better understand institutional racism by looking at the policing of gangs? So there are two really brilliant criminologists based up in Manchester called Becky Clark and Patrick Williams. And a few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, they were seeing all of these newspaper headlines, reports, documentaries on Channel 5 and Sky One and all of these brilliant broadcasters about this epidemic of gang violence in Britain. And of course, gang violence, like mugging, isn't a crime in and of itself. It's a category of crime. All right, and so like mugging, gang violence or gang crime vacuums up lots of existing crimes into this new category of crime, which kind of emerges in the 21st century to create the impression of a new problem and a different problem, right? Thus attributed to a new and different people, right? Generally migrant communities, communities of colour. And so what they did was they noticed that, the newspapers in Manchester were calling Manchester Gunchester, newspapers in Nottingham were calling Nottingham Shottingham. Over in London, they had these Gangs of London, a series in the London Evening Standard newspaper. And they noticed that the major police forces in Manchester and Nottingham and London and other significant cities were creating gangs databases, right, of all of the people that they've identified as being involved in a gang or a member of a gang. And if you're put onto these gangs databases, they can be used to monitor you more closely. They can be used to impose injunctions on you, which prevent you from going to certain places, speaking to certain people, including people in your own family, visiting, going to college or your favorite or your place of training or work. If you're a musician or an artist, they can prevent you from making music or performing that music or distributing that music. A whole host of different kinds of impositions. A report by Amnesty International called Trapped in the Matrix found that when put onto the gangs databases, the police would call up housing associations, tell them that the families that they're housing have people on the gangs database and they therefore lost their homes. People enrolled in further education colleges had the police call up the police called up the further education college and said, "You've enrolled people that we've got on our gangs databases." So people lost their place in college and education. So it has a huge effects. And of course, if you're on the gangs database and you are picked up by the police, you're far more likely to be charged, you're far more likely to be arrested, you're far more likely to be sent to court, you're far more likely to be found guilty, and you're far more likely to receive a longer custodial sentence, or in the case of many people, face deportation. And so what they wanted to do was they went to both Greater Manchester and London's Metropolitan Police, both Becky Clark and Rebecca and Patrick Williams, and said, can we have your gangs database, please, broken down by ethnicity? And they said, yep, sure, here you go. And then they said, so they asked them, how do you define a gang member? How do you define who's involved in a gang? And they said, it's anyone who's involved in what they called serious youth violence. And so serious youth violence is anything from relatively minor violent offences like common assaults, which is kind of like spitting or shoving someone, to very, very serious violent offences like discharging a firearm or attempted murder. This is right. Can we have all the people that you've identified as being involved in serious youth violence and have that broken down by ethnicity, please? They said, yeah, sure, here you go. And this is what they found. So you can see here in the top half of the screen are the results for Manchester, and in the bottom half of your screen are the results for London. So in the top half of your screen, you can see a pie chart that where 89% of the gangsters in Manchester are Black, Asian and minority ethnic, and only 11% of them are white, according to Greater Manchester's gangs database. However, when it comes to serious youth violence, 77% of the serious youth violence is carried out by white young people, and only 23% is carried out by Black, Asian and minority ethnic young people. Over in London, 80% of the people on the gangs database in London are Black, Asian or minority ethnic, only 20% of them are white. Yeah, when it comes to serious youth violence, it's 50-50, which is roughly proportionate with London's youth population. So what does that tell us? What that tells us is that the criteria the police say they're using for gang members is clearly not the criteria they are using. Because if it was, of course, the proportion of the racial proportionality of the pie charts for both gang members and serious youth violence would be the same, if not at least very similar. But what we see is in fact the case is that they're almost the inverse of each other in Manchester and very, very different to each other over in London. And this is an example of what I think is useful that we understand to be institutional racism. Right? And this is when, and I would define institutional racism as when the normal functioning of an institution produces racist outcomes. And I would say that the reason the normal functioning of these institutions produces racist outcomes isn't because, and this is really crucial, isn't because there are some terribly bigoted, horrible, racist police officers who sit in dimly lit rooms with the door closed, scheming and conspiring against Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities to put them onto the gang's database. I don't think that's what happens at all. What I would say in fact happens is that racism has been the normal functioning of policing in Britain, not simply for years or for decades or for generations, but I would actually go back further than that and say it's been the normal functioning of policing since the inception of British policing. And when I say the inception of British policing, I'm thinking further back than simply the creation necessarily of the formal policing in the early 19th century. I'm also thinking beyond Britain's borders, because for most of Britain's history, the majority of its policing hasn't taken place on the British mainland. It's taken place in its colonies, in its slave colonies in the Caribbean, in its settler colonies in Southern Africa, Australia, and parts of North America, and its other colonies, such as those in South Asia and Southeast Asia, parts of East Asia, and of course across the lion's share of the African continents, as well as much as what we now call the Middle East. And the colonization of these peoples required policing, required a huge amount of control, of discipline, of incarceration, of violence, which I don't have too much time to go into right now. But I would argue, therefore, that the reason the normal functioning of policing today produces racist outcomes is because policing emerges in Britain in not simply a national context, but in an imperial context. And because policing emerges in this imperial context to control these large colonized populations across the Americas and Africa and Asia and Australasia, racism plays a really fundamental role in rationalizing or justifying the kind of violence necessary to control these large colonized populations. And so perhaps we should be unsurprised, therefore, that many of the most vivid and effective kinds of crime, categories of crime, or criminal folk devils are also those which are very much linked to racial images, racialized images of the mugger, the gangster, the terrorist, the illegal immigrant, the gypsy Roma traveler. Race plays a really crucial role, therefore, I would say, in constructing these racial folk devils in order to, I think crucially, as I mentioned before, create the impression that this is the crisis that Britain is facing. This is the crisis that our government must ameliorate in order to reaffirm its legitimacy, not the economic crisis of capitalism, not the looming ecological and climate crisis, not the crisis of our pensions or of housing or in our healthcare systems that we've seen during the current pandemic, not the mental health crisis or the crisis of social care. None of these crises are the crises that this government should be dealing with. It is the crisis of law and order. It is the crisis of security that the government will deal with in order to reaffirm its legitimacy in the eyes of the nation. And so maybe we should be unsurprised, therefore, that over the last 30 years, since the late 1970s, early 1980s, when crime and law and order, security and borders became this popular mantra for governments in order to reaffirm their legitimacy, that we've seen a massive expansion in police, prison and border power. So to give some kind of general examples, the prison population in Britain since the early 1990s has almost doubled. The women's prison population has more than doubled. We're now incarcerating over twice as many women today as we were in the early 1990s. The power of the police is far greater than it ever has been. We have far more police officers than we've ever had. The number of police officers has grown steadily since the 1970s with a very small blip during austerity, but generally the trend has been upwards. And they've had more powers than ever, powers of surveillance to surveil our digital communications or to impose injunctions on us, like the ones that I've mentioned before, for people who are put onto the gangs database or people who are suspected of being terrorists or undocumented or what have you. We see more power in relation to the militarization of policing. More police carry firearms or tasers or spit hoods and, or other forms of violent weaponry. And we also see an increase in police power to stop, to search, to apprehend, to arrest, to incarcerate through the criminalization of not just crimes you might be familiar with, but newer and newer crimes relating to the distribution or use of drugs. Crimes related to the criminalization of assembly and protest, crimes related to different types of music which are considered to be gang affiliated, or political ideas which are seen to be terrorist affiliated, or simply the attempt by people who are undocumented to get a job or rent a home or access their national health service or simply live and breathe on this island. And I think it's in this context of this expansion in police and prison power, this continual move towards an ever more powerful and ever growing police and prison system, that we see the rise of movements like Black Lives Matter, as we, of course, I'm sure are all familiar with in the summer of 2020. And I think the two or three most popular and certainly radical slogans that emerged out of this movement were "the UK is not innocent" and "defund the police." And I'll probably deal with both of those before we take a break. The first is the first, the UK is not innocent, I think is really crucial for a number of reasons. I think the first reason the UK is not innocent was a popular slogan in the BLM protests, because very often Britain likes to pretend that racism is this thing that happens in America or used to happen in South Africa, but everything's kind of sorted out now. But here in Britain, we don't really do race, we do class. I mean, class is really the issue we do here in Britain. I think one of the reasons that Britain is able to do this is because Britain has been doing racism for a very long time, as long as America has been doing it. But of course, it hasn't necessarily been doing it so much on the British mainland. It's been doing it in its colonies, in Ireland, in its slave colonies in the Caribbean, across Africa, across Asia, across Australasia and elsewhere. And because of this geographical disjuncture, this geographical space in between Britain and its colonies, it's been able to, I guess, create a kind of conceptual or cultural barrier between itself and its empire. So it's able to disconnect itself from those histories of racism, right, that made Britain the largest slave trading nation in human history, that made Britain the nation which exterminated the indigenous peoples of Australasia, right, which colonized the lion's share of the African continent and South Asia and much of Southeast Asia as well. And I think we saw this, of course, this compelling urge for Britain to confront its history with a lot of the protests, a lot of the targets of these protests, right? They weren't simply targeting town centres and government buildings and police stations. They were targeting statues of slave owners, like in Bristol. They were targeting the architects of racial apartheid, like Cecil Rhodes. They were targeting they were targeting people like Winston Churchill, who is seldom remembered as being one of the overseers of colonial massacres and genocides in places like India and Kenya and other parts of Britain's crumbling empire in the middle of the 20th century. And so I think it's really crucial to therefore understand this history of Britain, to understand this history of racism, in order for us to better understand why it is that the normal function of its institutions today produce racist outcomes. Right? And you can, of course, see this, perhaps unsurprisingly, in its prison system as well, where Britain currently incarcerates Black people at the same rate as the United States incarcerates African Americans, and around a quarter of Britain's prison population are Black, Asian, minority ethnic, despite only constituting about 13% of the general population. Okay, slogan number 2, very quickly, defunding the police. Why was this such an important slogan, we think, for this movement? I would argue that it was such an important slogan because over the last 20 years in this country, we've seen a whole swathe of reforms to improve, or purportedly to improve, problems of institutional racism in Britain. We've seen diversity initiatives to create a more diverse police force and within other public institutions. We've seen training and education, most popularly at the moment, unconscious bias training. We've seen accountability initiatives such as police consultancy committees and other kinds of community consultancy projects on the behalf of the police. But as I've already demonstrated, hopefully, to death a little bit, none of these have done any work really in improving problems of institutional racism and policing. If anything, the problems that were around in the 1970s are still apparent and around, if not worse. So what does defunding therefore mean? Defunding the police therefore identifies the fact that despite this continual expansion of police and prison power, we haven't really seen a consummate decline in violence or harm within our society. We haven't seen a corresponding increase in safety within our communities. And then what it argues is that actually, if we look at the communities or the societies or the parts of the world where there are the highest levels of public safety, where there is the lowest levels of harm and violence. They're not the societies or the sections of our community which have police officers on every corner, where people are living under the greatest threat of incarceration. Think about your local middle-class suburb, for instance. You have relatively low levels of crime there, but not necessarily because people are under the threat of incarceration. What you have in middle-class communities are people who have access to a decent job, secure employment. They have access to decent housing generally, and access to good healthcare, very often decent mental health provision. They have access to decent youth services and another key social care for older people or people with disabilities or people who use drugs problematically or what have you. You have a whole swathe of forms of community infrastructure which are necessary, and economic and social infrastructure which is necessary for people to live a safe and relatively harm-free existence. And if we look at the societies in the world which have lower levels of harm and violence, they're not the societies which criminalize people the most, have the largest and most powerful prison systems or border regimes or police forces. They're the countries which have the lowest levels of inequality. They are the countries that have the highest levels of access to education and training, access to employment and decent housing, have stronger trade unions and community organizations. And so what this movement argues isn't simply that police and prisons are institutionally racist. That's one of the things they argue. They don't simply argue that police and prison expansion has failed to improve public safety and harm reduction, which it has. It also crucially argues that we need to begin to build alternatives to the police and prison system. And these alternatives need to be community-led. They need to be better housing, better access to education, better access to youth services, better access to mental health provision, and support for people, survivors of domestic violence and child abuse, or people who use drugs support for people who use drugs problematically. A whole swathe of social, community-led solutions to social problems. Because when we look at our prison system, our ever-expanding prison population, we don't necessarily see people who are dangerous and immoral. We see people who are more likely to be expelled from school, people more likely to have experienced homelessness and joblessness, have faced eviction from their home, being laid off from their job, more likely to have experienced child abuse or domestic violence, more likely to have used drugs problematically or have insecure immigration status. A whole swathe of social problems that can be dealt with social solutions. To maybe use an analogy or something that kind of maybe can illustrate it more vividly, a friend of mine, Derek Pennell, uses the analogy that getting the police and prison system to improve public safety is kind of like telling your landlord that you've got a leak in your roof and them coming to the door with a bucket. And then when you ring them a week later to tell them that the problem hasn't been sorted out, they turn up at your door a week later with a bigger bucket. Yes, while there is a leak in your roof, a bucket is a very useful thing to have to carry to catch those drops of water. But it's not going to get to the root of the problem. It's not going to fix that leaky roof. And while we continue to have a social and a welfare system and community sector, for which there are very few resources, and an ever-expanding police and prison system, the root causes of harm and violence in our society will not be ameliorated. Right? The inequalities that lead to people coming into contact with the criminal justice system through one way or another will not be effectively dealt with. And so what this movement for a police abolition argues isn't to close every prison tomorrow and sack every police officer the next day. It's instead arguing that we need to slowly reduce society's reliance on police and prison power and empower our communities through education, through the kinds of resources that can better enable them to not come into contact with the criminal justice system. Right? To use these community resources, whether it be youth services, mental health provision, support for survivors of domestic violence, support for people who use drugs problematically, support for people who are undocumented, stronger trade unions, stronger renters unions, all of these kinds of forms of community infrastructure can enable the most vulnerable people in our society to be far less likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. And the final thing that I think is really crucial about this is that it will also better enable us to challenge this government and to challenge the state in not dealing with the real crises that we're facing, not only as a country, but as a planet. It can better enable us to stop enabling this government in maintaining its legitimacy by dealing with this so-called law and order crisis. And it can better enable us and empower us to deal with the real crisis this country and the world is facing, the crisis of inequality that's leading to harm and violence within our communities, particularly the most vulnerable communities in our society, but of course also the looming ecological and climate crisis as well. And it's only by displacing this purported crisis of law and order that we can better deal with the real material crisis of planet and environment and society and our economy. And so I would argue, therefore, that prison and police abolition is far more than dealing with police racism and prison violence and border injustices. It's about understanding that we need to build alternatives to all of these systems of state violence and control if we're going to effectively develop alternatives to them. And so it incorporates people who work in mental health provision, work in youth services, work in education, for trade unions, for renters unions, for environmental justice organisations, incorporates all of these kinds of community and social and campaigning organisations and groups into being as integral to resistance to police and prison power as the kinds of protests which directly confronts these institutions that we might more easily recognise as being forms of resistance to police and prisons. And so understanding prison and police abolition as being about building as well as dismantling, I would say, is one of the crucial things that we need in order to not only challenge this failing and violent expansion of police, prison and border power, but also better enable us and better empower us to focus on the real material crises that we're facing in our communities, which are economic and ecological as well as political. And I'll leave it there because I've gone over a little bit.
Adam, thank you very much indeed. I think you offered a really, really useful way of connecting and mapping that history through the lens of inequality, racial injustice. And I think that latter part of the talk was certainly offered us an insight into what this future slowly might work towards. We said that we would give 5 minutes for kind of a break because it felt like that the content of that was quite quick and there was quite a lot there. So if we take a break now and come back, probably about, I don't want to be so kind of like minute orientated, but maybe about sort of 33 minutes past, so just after past. Sorry, no, my maths is all wrong. So if we come back after, so
23 minutes past?
Yeah. Just give people kind of a chance to take a comfort break and collect themselves. So, all right.
Great. All right, see everyone in 5. Thanks.
Okay, welcome back. We have about until about 7:45 for tonight's talk. We're going to take questions through the chat box, which I can read out, and also for anyone who is kind of raising a hand, happy for people to kind of come in that way too. Adam, I kind of just wanted to start with, whilst we're kind of waiting for people to warm up, just kind of look at the numbers. I mean, it was kind of interest to me that there's around 83,000 people in prison in Britain, matched with 132,000 police officers, so the bucket distributors, and 16 billion spent on said buckets to to use your friend's analogy. So just that sheer number, 16 billion that's spent on our policing system, you know, it's huge. And for those of us in, you know, kind of the social sector, environmental, voluntary sector, you know, that's a large sum of money, you know, that could be put towards causes and organisations that do so much frontline work. I had a question around what might be some of the first steps, first programmes. You know, you sort of said that there's a lot of existing services. I just wondered if there'd been things that kind of come to your mind around what, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I would say there have been some specific organisations which have been trying to do this work very explicitly. So some of the youth organisations that I work with, including Take Back the City and Forefront Project and No More Exclusions and United Borders, which are youth-led organisations, and a big part of their work is helping to reduce youth violence, right? So the harm that young people face and the lack of safety that exists for many young people in working class communities all over cities like London. But what they want to do is they want to reduce these problems of harm and violence that exist within their communities, whilst crucially at the same time creating alternatives to the police and prison system. And so they do this for a range of different projects, whether it be through community building projects, so working on specific estates and having artistic and music and cultural kinds of projects and infrastructure and things like that. But it also works with schools and mental health providers and people who provide advocacy for those who are undocumented, a whole swathe of different providers as well, to provide the kind of resources that a lot of their most vulnerable young people require in order to process the trauma they might have dealt with if they've experienced domestic violence or child abuse, or a friend of theirs has experienced serious violence, to deal with questions of addiction, to deal with questions, to better enable them to access work or training and housing, right, through renters unions and trade unions and these types of things. All of these different types of things that people need in order to live as safe a life as possible. And all of these organisations have very, very limited funding, have very, very limited resources. And these are just an example of some, but I mean, according to Unite, since 2012, more than 750 youth centres have closed, and over 4,500 youth workers have been laid off in England and Wales alone, right? So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of the most vulnerable young people in our society no longer having access to the kinds of support and guidance that can really help them be far less likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. But we can also think about the other things that we need investment into, right? Like far better housing. We spend far more money on police and prisons than we do in providing decent council housing. We spend far more money on police and prisons than we do on mental health provision and social care in this country. Right? All of these things that we're spending huge amounts of, that this government, I say we, that this government is spending huge amounts of money on, is not simply failing to provide the kind of safety that it claims that it is, but is also taking away from the kinds of community-led infrastructure which people need in order to live a safe and prosperous existence.
That's a really important figure that you put out there in terms of closure of youth centres. I mean, detached youth work is so paramount in terms of reaching out to young people in a really active youth-led way, isn't it? So it's quite shocking that these are the figures that we're looking at. I can see we've got a question here from Jabu. So if you want to unmute.
Yes, thank you, Amma. Thank you, Adam, for such an eloquent, talk. My name is Jabunala Hartley. I'm originally from South Africa. I live in Oxford. I founded the Mothers for Justice Ubuntu, which is very much like the normal exclusions. We've recently had Oxford's Road to Justice and invited people like us, John, to come and speak. I'm just going to quickly say the Mothers for Justice Ubuntu was just really focusing on families, how they are affected by the criminal justice system. I'm a mother that was also affected by the criminal justice system. But I was inspired to do it because of going through the experience of the court system, the plea bargaining that was basically being the sort of tragedy where they're forcing young people that they know already have criminal records, existing criminal records, to cough pleas for things that they didn't do. Really, really devastating, because at the time my son was about to enter university and he was forced to take cough a plea for something that he wasn't involved in because he had a prior criminal record. But more than anything, having grown up in South Africa, I used to feel that, as you are explaining, Adam, the systems were similar. And I used to find, whenever I say that, especially to a lot of people, it insults them because they want to differentiate themselves from an apartheid system, as if that's a really a sort of like harsh environment. And this was prevalent even when I was growing up in the 80s. And I would say to the anti-apartheid movement that I find it very similar that, you know, even though they were talking about apartheid as a legalized system, but I felt it existed in terms of how the estates were arranged in the UK, in terms of, I live in Oxford, who had Black Belize, which was predominantly Black people. We had Moorside in Manchester. We had all these places which were poor housing, ghettos with young Black kids being harassed by the police. So I'm really, really pleased to be part of this, you know, talk, because it really brought in a lot of things that I've always felt that, you know, when you talk about the US and talk about the UK, especially the industrializing of the prison system, it's happening here. People are being paid £1 an hour, to £1, like £2 a week to work with factories. So they're increasing the prison population to make use of them as pre-slaving, I mean, re-enslaving the people that are going into the system. So there's so much to unpack there. But thank you so much, Adam. I won't take your spot. I just wanted to say I was really, really impressed by this. And I mean, I've moved myself into a position. I'm now a councillor now in Oxford. I was chosen 2 weeks ago, and I am fighting for these initiatives that you're talking about in the community, where we need community-led policing. We don't need a police force. We need a police service that's helping the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jabu.
Thank you, Jabu. That was, really important. I'm going to look at Mothers for Justice Ubuntu as well. It sounds like a really important organization. But yeah, what Jabu was talking about is really crucial. We see, particularly through the discourse around gangs, the police using doctrines like joint enterprise and others to criminalize large numbers of young people if a violent incident takes place, by saying that large numbers, a significant group of people are all responsible for a specific act of violence because the police have decided that they're all part of the same gang. And this has been used to give very long custodial sentences to very young people, even if they haven't committed an offence, but has also led to a lot of young people being deported as well, because the police have told judges and juries that this young person is part of a so-called gang as well.
Thank you, Adam. We have a question coming from Grace in the chat box. Which governments currently, if any, are actually addressing that there is a legitimacy crisis in an effective way?
Well, unfortunately, both major political parties in this country are dealing with the crisis of legitimacy by, of course, doubling down on the so-called crisis of security, whether it be security at our borders, but I think increasingly also the moral panic around Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities. But I think we're also, of course, seeing the crisis of legitimacy being dealt with by both parties, but mainly this Conservative government, with the kind of nationalism, nationalist rhetoric, and nationalist kind of policies that we're seeing with their that we saw with their very successful 3-word manifesto, Get Brexit Done, and all of the kind of pomp and ceremony and very little actual material policy that arose out of it. So unfortunately, particularly since I think the end of Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party, there's very little parliamentary hope in these kinds of issues being addressed.
Okay, so it feels quite scarce, doesn't it? We have another question from Dance. Just wondering what your thoughts are on the police, crime, courts and sentencing bill.
That's a really great question. I think that, and it kind of links on from the previous question, I think, because whilst there is relatively little hope, I think, in our parliamentary system, I've never seen so much vibrancy in our community and grassroots campaigns and protest movements. Rather than the movements that kind of really became popularized in the summer of last year, right, led by Black Lives Matter, kind of dissipating, I feel like it's snowballed. And the most kind of radical demands that emerged out of this movement, right, to defund the police and invest in our communities, I think is being continued with the Kill the Bill movement, right, the resistance to this policing, crime, courts and sentencing bill, right? I'm sure most people are probably familiar with it, but it seeks to criminalise protests and the freedom of assembly, but also seeks to criminalise Gypsy, Roma, Traveller communities. It seeks to criminalise so-called gangs, by compelling service providers to identify suspicious injuries among young people who could be associated with so-called gang violence, thus criminalising people accessing healthcare or education or other non-police services. So there's a whole swathe of different oppressed peoples that are likely to be badly affected by this bill, as well as it affecting people more generally with the erosion of civil and political liberties. But I think what's also really crucial is that, as I mentioned, we've seen this groundswell, this massive social movement resisting this bill. And what's really, I think there are two things that are really, I find really inspiring about it. One of them is the broad base of this coalition, the fact that it's led by feminist organisations, which have really re-emerged in solidarity with Sarah Everard, but also migrant solidarity groups, looking at how this bill is going to affect undocumented peoples and peoples whose documented status is precarious. It's being led by youth groups like No More Exclusions and Forefront projects, looking at the ways in which it's going to affect young people, particularly young people in Black communities. It's being led by trade unions and other organisations which rely on protest and the freedom of assembly and the way in which that's likely to be eroded. It's being led by Gypsy, Roma, Traveller community organisations, and so I've never seen such a broad coalition challenging government policy in my relatively short life. But I think the other thing that's really inspiring and brings me real hope is that this coalition goes way beyond simply this bill. Right? It's not simply people coming together to try to get rid of one piece of legislation and then go back into their lives. For me, what it really signifies is that people are arguing beyond that this bill of expanding police and prison power and border power isn't simply about this expansion of police and prison and border power. It's about police, prison and border power in and of itself. And the most radical elements of this coalition are saying that we need to, as I've mentioned before, build alternatives, not just to this bill, but to these systems of violence and control more generally. And I think bringing the fact that this government is attacking so many people at the same time is not only bringing about a broad-based resistance to this bill, but it's bringing about a broad-based resistance to this kind of law and order governance that this authoritarian Conservative Party is riding on at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Adam. We've got another question coming in from Han. What are your hopes and fears for the argument of BLM and defund the police in terms of ongoing protest and real pressure on authorities and spending decisions? So will the groundswell continue enough and stay focused? How's it looking at the moment, would you say?
So I would say that this government has decided, has made a real clear decision to double down and reject all of the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement. Right? You can see this not just in this police crime courts and sentencing bill that we've been discussing, but you can also, of course, see it in their recent Sewell reports, right, where they've sought to dismiss any evidence or arguments that institutional racism exists in Britain, despite the overwhelming evidence of it. And so I don't have any hope that this government is going to have any kind of do any U-turns in terms of its spending on the kinds of services and provisions that we need. But what I do have hope for is that this current government's operating as it does is them imposing these new forms of authoritarianism, I think will be made impossible by this protest movement. I think that when, and I think it will happen because unfortunately the Labour Party are in favour of this as well, when this police crime and courts and sentencing bill is passed in Parliament, which I believe unfortunately that it will be made ungovernable, it will be made unenforceable by the protest movement that exists in resistance to it. And I think that that is the really crucial thing at the moment. Not necessarily that we can force this government to develop any sense of real humanity, unfortunately. But I think that the authoritarian governance that they're trying to impose on this country will be impossible with the broad movement of resistance that we're seeing challenging it.
Thank you. Yeah. Thumbs up there from Han. I guess, you know, we have seen such an increase in the 90s, as you said, in terms of our prison populations. You know, this feels like it could, you know, very easily, and probably is, following the trajectory of the US. I just wondered if you could, you know, kind of give us examples of, you know, countries around the globe, areas around the globe that successfully give us these kind of hopeful models of how kind of, I mean, I don't know whether it was community policing, but how community organisations and communities really deal with, manage, care for communities, such that there's a, you know, a reduction in criminalisation.
That's a great question. So I would say that community policing doesn't really, there's no evidence that it really reduces the harm or violence or ineffectiveness of policing. And I think that we should be, rather than trying to change policing to be more community oriented, we should be totally trying to find total non-police solutions to our social problems. And I think one of the ways in which our prison system has expanded massively, particularly our women's prison population, has been through the criminalisation of drugs. The vast majority of women who are incarcerated today reports either being incarcerated because of drug distribution, their own drug use, or the drug use of somebody else in their care. And countries such as Portugal, for instance, have over the last, I think, 5 years or so, decriminalised all drugs, right, including things like heroin and crack cocaine, right? And they've treated drug use not as a criminal justice issue, not as a law and order issue, as countries like Britain and the United States do, but as a public health issue. So when people are using drugs, rather than sending in the police, rather than sending in the border force, rather than using the power of the prison system, they bring in mental health provision. They bring in doctors, they bring in services for people who use drugs problematically. They provide people with clean needles, so they're less likely to spread diseases. They provide people with all of the kind of social care that is necessary in order for people to be able to, if they do choose to use drugs, use them safely. And the outcome of this has been not only a significant reduction in Portugal's prison population, but also a massive reduction in overdoses, a massive reduction in diseases and illnesses being transmitted through the sharing of needles and what have you, but also a massive reduction, crucially, in the kind of violence that we often associate with drug distribution in countries like Britain, right, with different criminalised peoples ending up being engaged in acts of violence against each other. This has also seen a massive reduction as well. So across the board, removing the police and prison system from how drugs are managed and treating it as a social and public health problem rather than a criminal justice problem, I think is a really useful way of thinking through these kinds of issues, right? And I think we can actually maybe take that kind of example from countries like Portugal, but others as well. But I think Portugal is a useful example because it's kind of a not too dissimilar an economy or polity, and they've decriminalised all drugs, not just marijuana, as some US states have or as the Netherlands have, and think about how we can do that with other kinds of social problems that lead to people coming into contact with our police and prison system.
Thank you, Adam. That's very helpful. We've got just about time to squeeze in one question, so it might have to be brief.
Sure.
Question from Roseanne. What are your thoughts on resisting institutional racism in Haiti, e.g. BAME degree awarding gaps and disproportionate dropout rates? How do you think about abolitionist thinking and how this can be best applied here? I know there are some great moves with the Free Black University. So.
That's a massive question, but a really important one, so thank you for that. I think there are maybe 3 or 4 key things that we can think about when we're challenging institutional racism in our universities. I think one of the first ones, of course, is thinking about the knowledge that's produced within our institutions, right? So the ways in which kind of Eurocentric ideas of what knowledge is useful and what knowledge is effective, I think is a real problem, not just simply within our social sciences and our humanities subjects and in how we understand history or politics or geography, but also I think as well in our physical sciences, right? And how we understand, what kind of engineering is important, what kind of science is important as well, because I think these kinds of Eurocentric forms of understanding science and technology, I think negates the importance of protecting the environment and the climate and what have you as well. And I think better enable these universities to take large investments from energy companies and oil companies and other organizations which are destructive for the environment, and therefore the knowledge that they fund is similarly destructive. Right, so knowledge production, I think, is a really crucial one, and of course, this links to teaching as well. I think the second thing that's really crucial as well, however, is linked to this first one, which is the political economy of the university. The fact that so many of our universities, as I mentioned, are funded not just by energy companies, like oil companies and what have you, but also funded by arms manufacturers, right, which helps reproduce forms of modern imperialism by funding wars and conflicts across the world. The fact that many universities are being funded by financial institutions, right, which are funding our economics departments, right, which shape what kind of economic knowledge is being produced. The fact that so many of these universities are being funded by pharmaceutical companies as well, which of course shapes the way the kinds of vaccines that are being produced and who can access these kinds of crucial life-saving medicines and vaccines. So the political economy of the university is a really fundamental way of understanding institutional racism on a global scale, and how the funding of war and climate catastrophe and carbon emissions and financial institutions and weapons manufacturers can all reproduces these forms of global inequalities as well. And I think the third thing is the way in which we understand the people who work at the university. And when I think about the people who work at the university, I don't simply identify the fact that most of our professors are aging white men, but the fact that most of the people who work, particularly in urban areas anyway, who work in our security or our cleaning services and our domestic and catering services are mainly women and women of colour. Right? And the fact that these are the hyper-exploited people within our universities. These are people who are on precarious contracts, have little access to pension schemes and holiday pay and sick pay and all of these kind of fundamentals to living a decent and fair working life. And so I think understanding that the political economy of the university in that sense as well is really crucial for understanding, for tackling institutional racism within our universities, by identifying the people who are most exploited within many of our institutions, of course being people of colour as well. And see a connection between the hiring and the working practices within the university, the political economy and the investments of the university, as well as the knowledge production and the teaching that takes place there, I think is one of the most important ways of us challenging institutional racism within higher education.
Adam, thank you. Thank you deeply for this sharing of your kind of knowledge, your research. It's been, a real insight. It's been fascinating to hear your perspective. Thank you, and thank you for giving so much in the Q&A as well. I I also want to thank all of the people that came along today. Thank you for your support and for coming along today. You know, this has it's a wonderful outcome to be able to share the proceeds with Account, and that's wonderful for us. I quickly
can I just say as well, thank you as well. Thank you so much to Persephone and to Annie for the invitation and for chairing, and to everyone for coming along and for the brilliant questions and discussion as well. Thank you all so much.
I mean, I just quickly wanted to, you know, to say, I mean, for anyone who wants to read Adam's work, there's Black Resistance to British Policing, as I mentioned in the introduction, and Empire's Endgame, Racism and the British State. And I'm sure there'll be many people who are wanting to reach for those books and get hold of those to deepen that kind of thinking. Brilliant, thanks, Dance. And also, if you go onto ONCA's website, we've put together a resource on abolition and policing, which we hope to continue adding to. And if anyone comes across anything, do get in touch with us by email. You know, it's a resource, it's live, and it's, you know, it's something that will be added to. And just to kind of lastly finish off, I think you mentioned so many wonderful activist organisations that are really making change happen. You know, so it sounded like to me that it's not necessarily something that we have to go away and scratch our heads over. Actually, there's a lot of brilliant people that are doing some brilliant work, and it seems like the human power of getting involved in these organisations is what really will make that change happen. So if there's a way of us maybe adding that to our resource list on the website, or even sharing that through social media, maybe we can be in touch with you, Adam, because I think that feels quite important. So we're just slightly over, so it's definitely time to say a final thank you, a goodbye. Take care.